Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the gritty, uncomfortable, and frankly miserable reality of being a knight during the Crusades. As you settle in for a moment of calm and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls stretches. Perhaps from cozy bedrooms in London to late-night apartments in Tokyo, all united in our appreciation for history's most wonderfully tedious details. If you enjoy immersing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing stories like this one, where we explore the fascinating mundane realities that shaped our world. Tonight, we're diving deep into a world where being a knight wasn't quite the romantic adventure Hollywood would have you believe. Picture, if you will, the year 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont and essentially said, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if all you violent warriors took your stabbing skills on a road trip to Jerusalem?" What followed was nearly 2 centuries of the most expensive, dangerous, and uncomfortable camping trips in human history, all in the name of religious devotion and, let's be honest, the promise of earthly riches and spiritual salvation. Now, when most people think of knights during the Crusades, they imagine gleaming armor, noble steeds, and heroic charges across sun-drenched battlefields. The reality, as we'll discover together tonight, was far more aromatic. And by aromatic, I mean it involved a lot more bodily functions, rotting food, and unwashed humanity than any medieval romance novel would dare admit. Congratulations. You're now about to spend the next hour learning why being a medieval knight heading to the Holy Land was essentially volunteering for the world's most expensive and dangerous gap year, complete with dysentery, bankruptcy, and a survival rate that would make modern extreme sports look like knitting circles. So settle in, dear listener, as we explore together why medieval knighthood during the Crusades was less for honor and glory, and more for reasons that seemed good at the time, but quickly proved to be terrible life choices. Let's begin our journey into the wonderfully boring and surprisingly horrible world of crusading knights. Chapter 1. The romantic delusion of taking the cross. Picture this. You're a minor nobleman in 11th century France, sitting in your drafty stone hall, listening to your local priest describe the wonders of the Holy Land and the spiritual rewards awaiting those brave enough to take up the cross. The year is 1096, and Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade has swept across Europe like wildfire, igniting the imaginations of knights from England to Germany. In your mind, you see yourself riding triumphantly through Jerusalem's gates, your sword gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. Crowds of grateful Christians cheering your name as you single-handedly reclaim Christ's birthplace from the infidels. The reality of becoming a crusader, however, began not with heroic proclamations or blessing ceremonies, but with what we might generously call medieval paperwork. Before you could even think about strapping on armor and pointing your horse toward Constantinople, you had to navigate the Byzantine bureaucracy of crusade preparation, which makes modern tax filing look like a refreshing hobby. First, there was the matter of the vow itself. Taking the cross wasn't simply a matter of saying, "I'm in," and grabbing your sword. Oh no, medieval Christianity had turned the process into an elaborate ritual that required witnesses, official church blessing, and most importantly, a detailed accounting of your assets and debts. You see, the church had learned from previous religious expeditions that knights had an unfortunate tendency to disappear into the Eastern Mediterranean, leaving behind unpaid bills, abandoned estates, and very angry creditors who somehow expected the church to sort out the mess. So before you could receive your official Crusader's cross, a piece of cloth that would be sewn onto your clothing to mark you as a holy warrior, you had to undergo what was essentially a medieval credit check. Local church officials would examine your lands, your livestock, your outstanding debts, and your family obligations with the thoroughness of modern mortgage brokers. They needed to ensure that your estate could function in your absence, that your debts could be managed, and that you weren't simply using the crusade as an elaborate way to skip town and avoid your responsibilities. This process could take months. Months of sitting in key ecclesiastical offices, providing testimony about your financial situation, securing letters of recommendation from other nobles, and proving that your motivation was genuinely spiritual rather than criminal. The church had apparently grown tired of knights who took crusading vows and then mysteriously ended up in taverns in Sicily rather than on the walls of Jerusalem. But let's say you passed this medieval background check. The next step was even more tedious: the logistics of actually organizing a crusading expedition. Modern military operations, for all their complexity, have the advantage of established supply chains, standardized equipment, and professional quartermaster corps. Medieval crusading armies had, well, they had enthusiasm and a profound faith that God would sort out the details. You, as a knight preparing for crusade, essentially became a one-man logistics operation. You needed to calculate how much food you'd require for a journey that could last anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on whether you survived long enough to see Jerusalem. You needed to arrange for fodder for your war horse, your pack horses, and any additional mounts you might acquire along the way. You needed to organize weapons, armor, maintenance supplies, camping equipment, and enough silver to purchase supplies in foreign lands whose currencies you didn't understand, and whose merchants had already heard about these wealthy Western warriors coming east. The planning phase of a crusade was essentially like organizing a camping trip to a foreign country, where you didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, had no reliable maps, couldn't trust the local authorities, and oh yes, everyone you met might be trying to kill you. But with less modern conveniences and significantly more dysentery. Most knights had never traveled more than 50 miles from their birthplace. The concept of journeying to Constantinople, let alone Jerusalem, was roughly equivalent to a modern suburban family deciding to vacation on Mars. You had to arrange for guides who claimed to know the routes east, though many of these guides had never actually been to the Holy Land themselves and were essentially medieval travel influencers, selling dreams of exotic adventures to credulous nobles with more money than sense. Then there was the question of your retinue. A knight didn't travel alone to the Crusades. Oh no, that would be far too simple. You traveled with your squires, your servants, your grooms, your cooks, and quite possibly your priest, your physician, and any family members who decided that a pilgrimage to Jerusalem sounded like a delightful family vacation. Each additional person multiplied your logistical problems exponentially, because medieval warfare had not yet discovered the concept of traveling light. Your war horse alone required more daily care and feeding than most peasant families. These weren't the sturdy, economical horses used for farming or transportation. War horses were essentially medieval luxury sports cars. Expensive to purchase, expensive to maintain, prone to break down at the worst possible moments, and absolutely useless for any practical purpose except looking impressive and occasionally trampling your enemies. But you couldn't go to war without a proper destrier, because arriving in the Holy Land on a farm horse would be like showing up to a formal dinner party in your pajamas. Your reputation as a knight depended not just on your fighting skills, but on your ability to look the part, which meant having the right horse, the right armor, the right weapons, and the right number of followers to demonstrate your importance. The financial reality of crusading was perhaps the most boring and yet most crucial aspect of the entire enterprise, one that medieval chroniclers glossed over in favor of describing heroic deeds and divine interventions. But the simple truth was that going on crusade was ruinously expensive, and most knights who took the cross had only the vaguest understanding of what they were signing up for financially. Consider the basic economics. A knight's normal annual income came from his lands, specifically from the rents and agricultural products generated by peasants working his estates. When he decided to go crusading, he was essentially choosing to abandon his primary source of income for an indefinite period, while simultaneously taking on the massive expenses of equipping and maintaining a military expedition to the other side of the known world. The cost began accumulating immediately. A basic set of mail armor, the kind that might actually keep you alive in combat, cost roughly the equivalent of a luxury car in today's money. A proper war horse cost about the same as a small house. Weapons, camping equipment, food supplies, and transportation added up to amounts that would bankrupt most modern families. And remember, this was in an era when most people's entire annual income wouldn't buy a decent smartphone. Many knights solved this problem through what historians politely call asset liquidation, and what the knights themselves probably called selling everything I own to fund this crazy adventure. They mortgaged their lands, sold their livestock, borrowed money at interest rates that would make modern credit card companies blush, and entered into financial arrangements with merchants and moneylenders that essentially guaranteed they would return from the Crusades either wealthy from plunder or completely ruined. The Church, recognizing that bankruptcy wasn't conducive to holy warfare, offered certain financial incentives. Crusaders received temporary protection from their creditors, essentially a medieval version of bankruptcy protection that prevented their enemies from seizing their lands while they were away fighting for Christ. They also received indulgences, which was essentially a spiritual get-out-of-purgatory free card, though the temporal benefits were less clear. But here's where the economics became particularly interesting. Most knights vastly underestimated the costs of the journey itself. They planned for the expense of reaching the Holy Land, but they failed to account for the reality that crusading armies moved slowly, got lost frequently, faced unexpected obstacles, and had an unfortunate tendency to cede cities for months at a time, while their supplies dwindled and their expenses mounted. A journey that was supposed to take 6 months could easily stretch to 2 years. Supplies that were supposed to last until Constantinople might be exhausted somewhere in the mountains of Anatolia. Horses that were supposed to carry you gloriously into Jerusalem had an annoying habit of dying of disease, exhaustion, or enemy arrows somewhere in Syria, leaving you to either walk the rest of the way or purchase replacement mounts at whatever ruinous prices local merchants chose to charge desperate crusaders. The result was that many knights found themselves financially ruined long before they ever saw the walls of Jerusalem. They arrived in the Holy Land with empty purses, exhausted horses, and equipment that had been sold, traded, or lost along the way. Some turned to mercenary work, hiring themselves out to Byzantine generals or local princes who needed experienced Western cavalry. Others simply gave up and tried to make their way home, though the return journey was just as expensive and dangerous as the outward trip. Those who did make it to Jerusalem often discovered that the city, once conquered, offered limited opportunities for the kind of plunder that might recoup their investments. The Holy Land was not, as many had imagined, a region flowing with milk and honey, where wealthy Muslim merchants lined up to hand over their treasures to victorious Christian knights. It was, instead, a region that had been devastated by decades of warfare, where the local economy had been disrupted by the constant passage of armed groups, and where whatever wealth existed was carefully guarded by people who had learned to hide their valuables from marauding armies. The few knights who did manage to establish themselves permanently in the Crusader states often did so by abandoning any pretense of returning home. They married local women, adopted local customs, and gradually transformed from European knights into Levantine lords, whose lifestyle and priorities bore little resemblance to those they had left behind in France or Germany. But perhaps the most sobering economic reality was the mortality rate. Medieval warfare was not kind to investment portfolios. Knights who spent fortunes equipping themselves for crusade had roughly a 50% chance of dying before they ever returned home, which meant that all their financial planning, all their asset liquidation, and all their careful preparation essentially amounted to very expensive suicide missions. The families left behind often found themselves in desperate financial straits. Wives struggled to manage estates that had been mortgaged to fund their husbands' crusading ambitions. Children inherited debts rather than wealth. The very communities that had celebrated their local heroes' departure for the Holy Land sometimes found themselves economically devastated by the loss of their most important landowners and the debts those landowners had accumulated in pursuit of spiritual salvation. The actual process of recruiting for a crusade reveals perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about these holy wars. While the rhetoric was all about spiritual devotion and religious duty, the reality involved a complex mixture of economic desperation, social pressure, criminal opportunism, and genuine faith that created armies whose motivations were far more complicated than medieval chroniclers wanted to admit. Pope Urban II's famous speech at Clermont in 1095 was masterfully crafted to appeal to different audiences simultaneously. To the nobility, he offered the promise of spiritual salvation and earthly glory. To the poor, he suggested that the journey east might provide opportunities for advancement impossible in Europe's rigid social hierarchy. To criminals and social outcasts, he offered a chance at redemption and a fresh start. To merchants, he painted visions of new trade routes and exotic markets. The beauty of the crusading message was that everyone could hear what they wanted to hear. But the actual recruitment process was far more mundane than inspirational speeches and divine visions. Local priests went from village to village, essentially conducting what we might recognize today as a medieval military recruitment drive. they offered practical incentives alongside spiritual ones. Crusaders would be exempt from taxes during their absence, protected from legal prosecution for previous crimes, and given the church's official protection for their families and property. For many knights, particularly younger sons, who had inherited little or nothing from their fathers, the crusade represented one of the few available paths to wealth and status. Medieval Europe's inheritance laws meant that the eldest son received everything, leaving his brothers to either join the church, serve as professional soldiers, or somehow acquire their own lands through marriage, purchase, or conquest. The Crusades offered a socially acceptable form of conquest, blessed by the church and celebrated by society. The recruitment process also reveals the surprisingly international character of crusading armies. These weren't national expeditions, but rather collections of regional groups, each led by local nobles who had taken the cross and convinced their followers to join them. A typical crusading army might include Norman knights from southern Italy, German nobles from the Rhine Valley, French counts from Provence, and English barons who had decided that the Holy Land offered better opportunities than dealing with whatever king currently occupied the throne in London. Communication between these groups was a constant problem. They spoke different languages, followed different military traditions, and had different ideas about everything from camp discipline to battlefield tactics. The miracle isn't that crusading armies sometimes succeeded in their objectives, but that they managed to hold together long enough to reach the Eastern Mediterranean without dissolving into complete chaos. The role of women in crusade recruitment is particularly fascinating and largely ignored by contemporary chroniclers who preferred to focus on masculine military virtues. But women were crucial to the entire enterprise, not just as supporters, but as active participants in the decision-making process. A knight couldn't simply announce that he was taking the cross and expect his wife to cheerfully wave goodbye as he disappeared for several years. Medieval marriages were economic partnerships, and major financial decisions like mortgaging the family estate to fund a crusade required negotiation and agreement. Many women actively encouraged their husbands' participation in crusades, sometimes for religious reasons, but often for more practical considerations. A successful crusade might bring back enough wealth to improve the family's status permanently. An unsuccessful crusade might at least remove a troublesome husband whose gambling, drinking, or political activities had become problematic. The historical record contains numerous examples of noble women who managed their families' affairs more successfully during their husband's absence than the men had managed them when present. The recruitment of non-noble participants reveals even more interesting social dynamics. Crusading armies needed far more than knights to function effectively. They needed craftsmen to maintain equipment, cooks to prepare meals, grooms to care for horses, engineers to construct siege equipment, physicians to treat wounds and diseases, priests to provide spiritual services, and merchants to procure supplies. These support personnel often made up the majority of any crusading expedition, though they rarely appear in the dramatic chronicles that focused on knightly combat. For skilled craftsmen, joining a crusade offered opportunities unavailable in Europe's guild-dominated economy. A blacksmith or carpenter who traveled to the Holy Land might find his skills valued far more highly than they would be in his home village, where guild regulations limited both his opportunities and his income. Some of these craftsmen established themselves permanently in the Crusader states. where their expertise in European military technology made them valuable citizens. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Crusade recruitment was how quickly enthusiasm could turn to regret once the practical realities became apparent. Many chroniclers describe knights who took the cross in moments of religious fervour, only to spend months or years trying to find ways to escape their vows without bringing ecclesiastical punishment upon themselves. The Church had anticipated this problem and made crusading vows legally binding, but determined individuals could usually find sympathetic priests willing to commute their vows in exchange for appropriate donations to local religious institutions. The result was that crusading armies were constantly changing in composition as new recruits joined and disillusioned veterans found excuses to return home. By the time most expeditions reached the Holy Land, they bore little resemblance to the armies that had originally departed from Europe, having been transformed by months of travel, combat, disease, and the gradual filtering out of participants who discovered that holy war was far less appealing in practice than it had seemed in theory. And as we leave this exploration of how knights actually became crusaders, let's turn our attention to what happened once these expensively equipped, highly motivated, and generally unprepared medieval warriors actually began their journey eastward, where they would discover that the phrase, "getting there is half the fun," was definitely not coined by anyone who had ever tried to cross medieval Europe with a war horse and a lifetime savings converted into portable assets. Chapter 2. The Logistics of Medieval Travel to Hell. Picture this. You've sold half your estate, mortgaged the other half, kissed your wife goodbye, and assembled your little army of followers for the greatest adventure of your medieval lifetime. You're standing at the edge of your known world. Perhaps it's the gates of Regensburg, or maybe you're looking across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, with absolutely no reliable idea of how to actually get to Jerusalem. Congratulations, you're now experiencing what medieval knights called navigation, which was essentially a combination of wishful thinking, following rumours, and hoping that God would provide turn-by-turn directions. The first and most fundamental problem facing any crusading army was the complete absence of reliable maps. Now, this might seem like a minor inconvenience to modern travellers accustomed to GPS systems that can locate the nearest coffee shop within 3 feet. But imagine trying to plan a military expedition across 3,000 miles of unfamiliar territory, armed with nothing more detailed than a piece of parchment showing that Jerusalem was somewhere over there past the big water and the desert bits. Medieval maps, when they existed at all, were more artistic expressions than geographical tools. The famous Mappa Mundi type charts showed the world as a circle with Jerusalem at the center, surrounded by various biblical locations and mythical creatures, which was theologically satisfying but practically useless when you actually needed to know whether to turn left or right at the Danube River. These maps were designed to illustrate religious concepts rather than provide travel guidance, which meant that armies trying to use them for navigation were essentially following medieval fantasy literature rather than geographical reality. The standard route to the Holy Land involved travelling overland through the Byzantine Empire, which sounds straightforward until you realise that the Byzantine Empire in the 11th and 12th centuries was undergoing its own military and political crises and wasn't particularly enthusiastic about hosting large armies of armed Westerners who claimed to be there to help. The land route required crossing the Balkans, passing through Constantinople, traversing Anatolia, and then somehow navigating the complex political landscape of Syria and Palestine. A journey that took most armies between 6 months and 2 years, depending on how frequently they got lost, besieged, or distracted by opportunities for plunder. The alternative was the sea route, which involved chartering ships in Italian ports and sailing directly to the Levantine coast. This sounds much more efficient, and indeed, many later crusades adopted maritime transportation. But early crusading armies were fundamentally land-based operations built around heavy cavalry, which meant bringing war horses across the Mediterranean. Medieval ships were not designed for equestrian passengers, and the process of loading, transporting, and unloading horses that had been bred for size and aggression, rather than docility, was an adventure in itself. Sea travel also meant surrendering control of your expedition to ship captains whose primary concern was profit rather than holy warfare. Italian merchants quickly recognized that crusaders represented a lucrative market. Wealthy customers who needed transportation desperately enough that they would pay premium prices for cramped, uncomfortable passage on ships that were often older, slower, and less seaworthy than the vessels reserved for regular commercial cargo. But let's assume you chose the overland route, which most early crusaders did. Your first challenge was simply getting out of Western Europe, which required crossing territories controlled by dozens of different lords, each with their own ideas about taxation, customs duties, and appropriate hospitality for armed pilgrims. Some local rulers saw crusading armies as opportunities for profit, imposing transit fees, market taxes, and accommodation charges that could quickly drain an expedition's resources. Others viewed large groups of foreign knights as potential threats to local stability, and either demanded hostages to guarantee good behavior or simply refused passage entirely. The result was that crusading armies rarely followed straight routes to their destinations. Instead, they wandered across the European countryside like medieval tourists without guidebooks, following rumors about safe passages, friendly rulers, and available supplies. They would spend weeks traveling north to avoid a particular mountain pass, only to discover that the alternative route involved crossing territories controlled by lords who demanded even higher transit fees. Communication with local authorities was another constant challenge. Most knights spoke only their regional dialects of French, German, or English, while the people they encountered along the way spoke Hungarian, Bulgarian, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, or any of dozens of other languages. Negotiations for safe passage, food supplies, or simple directions often involved elaborate pantomime performances, with heavily armed medieval warriors attempting to communicate their peaceful intentions through interpretive dance. The practical problems of moving large groups across unfamiliar territory were compounded by the fundamental fact that medieval armies were not self-sufficient. Unlike modern military units that carried their own supplies and equipment, crusading armies depended on purchasing food, fodder, and replacement equipment from local markets along their routes. This meant that every major city or town became a potential bottleneck where thousands of people and animals would converge simultaneously, overwhelming local food supplies and driving prices to levels that made crusading economically unsustainable. Local populations quickly learned to hide their food stores and livestock when crusading armies approached, not necessarily out of hostility, but simply because feeding several thousand visitors would leave nothing for the residents themselves. The result was that even friendly territories became problematic for large expeditions, creating a vicious cycle where the failure to find adequate supplies forced armies to scatter into smaller groups to forage more efficiently, which made them vulnerable to attack and made coordination even more difficult. Weather added another layer of complexity to medieval navigation. Crusading armies usually departed in spring, hoping to reach the Holy Land before winter made travel impossible. But they had no reliable way to predict how long any particular segment of their journey would take. An army that expected to cross the Alps in May might find itself attempting the passage in September after delays caused by political negotiations, supply shortages, or simply getting lost in unfamiliar territory. The reality of actually moving a crusading army across medieval Europe reveals just how wildly optimistic most knights were about the practical challenges of their holy mission. What looked like a straightforward journey on whatever maps existed became an endless series of logistical nightmares that would have challenged modern military planners equipped with satellite communications, mechanized transport, and professional quartermaster corps. A typical crusading army wasn't just a collection of knights riding toward Jerusalem. It was essentially a mobile medieval city, complete with all the support structures necessary to keep several thousand people and their animals alive, healthy, and functional across months or years of travel. The knights themselves were actually a minority within these expeditions. For every armored warrior on horseback, there might be 5 or 10 non-combatants, squires, servants, grooms, cooks, craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and family members who had decided that a pilgrimage to the Holy Land sounded like an interesting family vacation. The daily routine of movement began before dawn, when horns would sound throughout the camp to wake everyone for another day of medieval misery. First came the morning prayers, because even holy warriors needed divine guidance to figure out which direction to travel, and whether today would be the day they finally found the correct road to Constantinople. Then came the complicated process of breaking camp, which involved packing hundreds of tents, loading wagons with supplies and equipment, saddling horses, organizing the marching order, and dealing with all the people who had somehow wandered off during the night and needed to be located before the army could move. The marching order itself was a complex piece of medieval choreography that balanced military necessity with social hierarchy. The most important nobles rode at the front, both because their status demanded it and because someone needed to make decisions about which fork in the road to take. Behind them came their immediate retinues, followed by the main body of knights, then the infantry, and finally the enormous baggage train that carried everything necessary to keep this mobile city functioning. The baggage train was where the real logistical challenges became apparent. Medieval armies required vast quantities of equipment and supplies that had to be transported on wagons pulled by oxen or pack animals. There were weapons and armor for the fighters, tools for the craftsmen, cooking equipment for preparing meals, camping gear for shelter, medical supplies for treating injuries and diseases, and personal belongings for everyone from knights to servants. The wagons also carried the army's treasury, food supplies, fodder for the horses, and trade goods that could be sold or bartered for local supplies. Managing this baggage train required more organizational skill than most medieval nobles possessed. Wagons broke down constantly on rough roads. Oxen went lame or died from exhaustion or disease. and valuable supplies had an annoying tendency to disappear during river crossings or mountain passes. The people responsible for maintaining the baggage train needed to be part mechanic, part veterinarian, part accountant, and part detective, tracking missing equipment while keeping hundreds of vehicles operational under conditions that would challenge modern logistics experts. The pace of travel was determined by the slowest elements of the army, which meant that heavily loaded wagons and walking infantry set the speed for everyone else. A good day might see the army advance 15 or 20 miles, but many days produced much less progress due to bad roads, bad weather, or the need to stop and negotiate with local authorities about passage rights or supply purchases. Some days produced no forward movement at all when the army had to wait for bridges to be repaired, rivers to become fordable, or mountain passes to clear of snow. Water was a constant concern that modern travellers rarely consider. An army of several thousand people and animals required enormous quantities of fresh water daily, not just for drinking, but for cooking, cleaning equipment, and maintaining basic hygiene. Rivers and streams that could easily supply a small village became inadequate when a crusading army arrived, forcing commanders to either limit the army's size or spend extra days in each location, while everyone took turns accessing limited water sources. Food procurement was even more challenging than water management. Medieval agriculture was barely adequate to feed the existing population under normal circumstances, so the sudden arrival of several thousand additional mouths to feed could quickly exhaust local food supplies. Crusading armies tried to solve this problem by carrying food supplies, purchasing provisions in advance, and foraging for wild foods. But none of these solutions was entirely reliable. Carried food supplies were limited by transport capacity and spoilage rates. Preserved foods like salted meat, dried grains, and hard cheese could last for weeks or months, but they were expensive, took up valuable wagon space, and provided a monotonous diet that led to nutritional deficiencies and morale problems. Fresh foods were more palatable and nutritious, but they spoiled quickly and were difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. Purchasing provisions required finding local markets that had surplus food available, and merchants willing to accept whatever currency the Crusaders carried. Many regions had little surplus production available for sale, while others were suspicious of large groups of armed foreigners and preferred not to conduct business with them. Even when food was available for purchase, the sudden arrival of several thousand customers could drive prices to levels that made feeding the army economically unsustainable. Foraging was theoretically free, but practically dangerous and time-consuming. Soldiers sent out to gather wild foods, hunt game, or requisition supplies from local farms often got lost, were captured by hostile locals, or simply deserted when they realized that life as a crusader was less appealing than they had anticipated. Successful foraging also required local knowledge about what plants were edible, where game animals could be found, and which communities might have surplus food available. Knowledge that most crusading armies lacked entirely. The cumulative effect of months spent dealing with navigation problems, supply shortages, and logistical failures was that most crusading armies arrived in the eastern Mediterranean bearing little resemblance to the well-equipped, highly motivated forces that had originally departed from Western Europe. By the time they reached Constantinople, or the Holy Land itself, they had been transformed by their journey into something that was part military expedition, part refugee column, and part traveling circus of desperate people trying to salvage something meaningful from what had become an increasingly expensive disaster. The psychological impact of the journey was perhaps even more significant than the physical hardships. Knights who had imagined themselves as heroic warriors on a divine mission gradually discovered that they were actually participants in a poorly planned camping trip with armed strangers who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had different ideas about everything from military tactics to personal hygiene. The social dynamics within crusading armies became increasingly strained as the journey progressed, and the gap between expectations and reality became impossible to ignore. Noble knights who had expected to be treated with appropriate deference found themselves competing for limited resources with German peasants, Italian merchants, and French criminals, all of whom claimed equal status as soldiers of Christ. Traditional hierarchies that worked perfectly well in European feudal society made little sense when everyone was equally miserable, equally lost, and equally dependent on the group's collective ability to find food and shelter. Arguments over leadership were constant and increasingly bitter. Each major noble in the army typically commanded his own contingent of followers and expected to have a voice in strategic decisions, but coordinating military movements among dozens of semi-independent leaders proved nearly impossible. Decisions that should have taken minutes to make became the subjects of lengthy debates that could paralyze an entire army for days, while the various commanders argued about routes, tactics, supply allocation, and precedence. The problem was compounded by the international character of most crusading armies. Norman knights from Sicily had different military traditions than German nobles from Bavaria, who in turn had different approaches to warfare than English barons or French counts. These differences weren't merely technical. They reflected fundamentally different ideas about honor, leadership, and the proper conduct of holy war. What one group considered standard military procedure, another might view as cowardice or impiety. Cultural misunderstandings were inevitable and often explosive. Food preferences that were perfectly normal in one region became sources of suspicion or disgust to people from other areas. Religious practices that were standard in one part of Europe were viewed as strange or heretical by Christians from other regions. Even basic social customs like greeting rituals, eating arrangements, and sleeping accommodations became sources of friction when people from different cultural backgrounds were forced to live in close proximity for months at a time. The financial pressures of extended travel created additional tensions within crusading armies. Knights who had budgeted carefully for a 6-month journey found their resources exhausted after a year of unexpected delays and expenses. Some tried to solve this problem by borrowing money from other crusaders, creating debt relationships that complicated command structures and military decisions. Others resorted to selling equipment, livestock, or even followers to raise cash, gradually reducing their military effectiveness as they struggled to remain financially solvent. The most desperate turned to what medieval chroniclers euphemistically called foraging, but what local populations more accurately described as robbery. Hungry, broke, and far from home, some crusaders decided that taking supplies from non-Christians was not only acceptable, but actually part of their holy mission. This behavior created diplomatic problems with Byzantine authorities, who had expected their Western allies to behave more like guests and less like occupying armies. Disease was perhaps the most devastating factor in the gradual dissolution of crusading armies during their eastward journey. Medieval armies had no understanding of sanitation, epidemiology, or basic public health measures, which meant that concentrating thousands of people and animals in temporary camps created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Dysentery, typhus, malaria, and various unnamed fevers swept through crusading armies with predictable regularity, killing more knights than enemy action and leaving survivors weakened and demoralized. The medical care available to sick crusaders was primitive even by medieval standards. Most armies included a few physicians or monks with medical training, but their knowledge was based on classical texts rather than practical experience, and their treatments often made patients sicker rather than better. Bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies were the standard responses to most illnesses, regardless of symptoms or severity. The psychological impact of watching friends and followers die from preventable diseases while pursuing a holy mission that seemed increasingly pointless was devastating to army morale. Knights who had expected to die gloriously in battle against the enemies of Christ instead found themselves nursing dysentery in Turkish mountains or burning with fever in Bulgarian forests, wondering why God seemed so indifferent to their suffering. By the time most crusading armies reached their destinations, they had been reduced to a fraction of their original size and effectiveness. Some contingents had lost 50% or more of their original members to death, disease, desertion, or simple disappearance. The survivors were often exhausted, impoverished, and disillusioned, having discovered that holy war involved far more mundane suffering and far less divine intervention than they had anticipated. And as we leave this exploration of how crusading armies actually moved across medieval Europe, let's turn our attention to what happened when these depleted, demoralized, and generally unprepared forces finally encountered the sophisticated military opposition waiting for them in the Eastern Mediterranean. Chapter 3. The Armor Problem. Fashion versus function in medieval warfare. Picture this delightful scenario. You've spent approximately the equivalent of a luxury car on what your armourer assured you was the finest male hauberk available in 12th century Europe. A magnificent creation of interlocked iron rings that gleams magnificently in the morning sun and makes you feel like the very embodiment of Christian knighthood. You've practiced walking in it, riding in it, and even sleeping in it, because your romantic notions of warfare suggest that proper knights never remove their armour. Now you're 3 months into your journey toward Jerusalem, somewhere in the mountains of Anatolia, and you're beginning to suspect that whoever invented medieval armor had never actually tried to fight a war while wearing it. The reality of medieval armor during the crusading period was a fascinating study in the conflict between theoretical protection and practical usability. The mail hauberks that formed the primary defensive equipment for most crusading knights were marvels of medieval craftsmanship, requiring hundreds of hours of skilled labor to create and representing a significant investment in both materials and expertise. Each individual ring had to be forged, shaped, and linked to its neighbors in a pattern that would provide maximum protection, while still allowing the wearer some degree of mobility. But here's where medieval military technology ran into the uncomfortable realities of human physiology and basic physics. A full male hauberk, complete with coif, leggings, and mittens, weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. depending on the size of the wearer and the thickness of the rings. This might not sound overwhelming to modern fitness enthusiasts, but consider that this weight was distributed across your shoulders and torso, creating pressure points that became increasingly painful during extended wear. The process of actually putting on a full suit of mail armor was an elaborate ritual that required assistance from at least one other person, preferably someone who understood the complexities of medieval military fashion. First came the padded undergarments, thick woolen or linen garments designed to prevent the mail rings from chafing directly against your skin. Then, the mail shirt itself, which had to be carefully positioned to provide maximum coverage while still allowing arm movement. The coif protected your head and neck, but it also restricted peripheral vision and made it difficult to hear commands or approaching enemies. Medieval armorers had made various ingenious attempts to solve the fundamental problem of creating protection that was both effective and wearable. Some hauberks featured split tails that could be tied up for walking or left down for mounted combat. Others included reinforced sections at the shoulders and chest where enemy weapons were most likely to strike. The most expensive suits included articulated joints at the elbows and knees that theoretically allowed better movement, though the reality was that any significant physical activity in mail armor was exhausting and awkward. The climate challenges of wearing 40 pounds of iron rings became apparent almost immediately to Crusaders leaving the temperate regions of Western Europe for the warmer climates of the Eastern Mediterranean. Mail armor was designed for the cool, damp conditions of northern France and England, where the primary concern was staying warm rather than staying cool. In the heat of Syrian summers or during long marches across Anatolian steppes, wearing full mail armor became a form of slow-motion torture. Iron conducts heat efficiently, which meant that mail hauberks became miniature ovens when exposed to direct sunlight. Knights who had imagined themselves cutting impressive figures on sun-drenched battlefields discovered that wearing metal armor in desert conditions was like being slowly cooked from the inside out. The padded undergarments that were essential for preventing chafing became soaked with sweat within hours, creating a moist, warm environment that was ideal for bacterial growth and skin infections. The maintenance requirements of mail armor were another aspect of medieval warfare that Romantic literature preferred to ignore. Iron rings that were constantly exposed to moisture, whether from rain, sweat, or river crossings, developed rust with depressing regularity. Maintaining a mail hauberk required daily cleaning, oiling, and inspection for damaged or broken rings. This maintenance had to be performed by someone with appropriate skills and tools, which meant that every knight needed access to either a skilled armorer or at least a competent blacksmith. But finding qualified armorers in the middle of Anatolia or the deserts of Syria proved surprisingly difficult. Most crusading armies included a few craftsmen capable of basic metalwork, but creating or repairing mail armor required specialized knowledge and tools that weren't readily available in campaign conditions. A single broken ring could compromise the effectiveness of an entire section of armor, and repairing mail properly required the ability to forge new rings that matched the original specifications exactly. The weight distribution problems of mail armor became more apparent during extended campaigns, when knights had to wear their protection for days or weeks at a time. The shoulder straps that supported the hauberk gradually stretched under the constant weight, causing the armor to hang lower and lower on the wearer's body. This not only reduced the armor's protective effectiveness, but also created new pressure points and made movement even more difficult. Medieval military theory suggested that properly fitted armor should allow a knight to mount his horse, fight effectively, and even sleep comfortably. But the reality was that most armor was a compromise between protection and mobility that satisfied neither requirement completely. Armor that was loose enough to allow comfortable movement provided less protection against enemy weapons, while armor that fitted tightly enough to provide maximum protection severely restricted the wearer's ability to fight effectively. The psychological impact of wearing armor was perhaps as significant as the physical challenges. Knights who had trained extensively in their protective gear often developed a full sense of security that led to tactical mistakes in actual combat. The feeling of being encased in iron rings could encourage reckless behavior that endangered not only the individual knight, but also his companions, who might be forced to rescue him from situations his armor couldn't actually protect him from. The experience of actually living in medieval armor during a months-long military campaign reveals just how poorly suited these protective systems were for anything except very brief, very specific combat situations. What worked adequately for a tournament that lasted a few hours became a form of extended torture when worn day after day during the grueling conditions of crusading warfare. The basic hygiene challenges of wearing male armor were staggering and rarely discussed in polite medieval society. The padded undergarments that were essential for preventing the armor from chafing directly against the skin quickly became saturated with sweat, blood from minor cuts and scrapes, and various other bodily fluids that accumulated during normal daily activities. These garments couldn't be removed easily while the armor was in place, and removing the armor completely was a time-consuming process that required assistance and left the knight vulnerable if enemies approached unexpectedly. The result was that most crusading knights went weeks or even months without properly cleaning either their undergarments or their armor, creating sanitary conditions that would horrify modern military medical personnel. The moist, warm environment inside male hauberks became breeding grounds for bacteria, fungi, and various parasites that medieval medicine had no effective treatments for. Skin infections, rashes, and various forms of medieval athlete's foot were virtually universal among crusading knights, though these conditions were rarely mentioned in the heroic chronicles that focused on military glories rather than medical realities. The process of eating while wearing armor presented its own unique challenges. Male coifs covered most of the head and neck, leaving only the face exposed, but they also restricted jaw movement and made it difficult to open the mouth wide enough to eat normal-sized portions of food. Many knights developed elaborate techniques for consuming meals through the narrow opening provided by their armor, usually involving cutting food into very small pieces and eating very slowly and carefully. Drinking presented even greater difficulties. The male coif made it nearly impossible to tilt the head back far enough to drink from normal cups or bottles, and the weight of the armor made bending forward to reach water sources awkward and potentially dangerous. Many knights solved this problem by using straws made from hollow reeds or metal tubes, though these required constant cleaning to prevent bacterial growth and were easily lost or damaged during travel. The bathroom facilities available to medieval armies were primitive under the best circumstances, but using them while wearing 40 pounds of armor was an adventure that tested both physical flexibility and mechanical ingenuity. Medieval chroniclers, being gentlemen of refined sensibilities, preferred not to discuss these intimate details of military life, but the practical challenges of managing basic bodily functions while encased in metal rings were considerable and contributed significantly to the general misery of extended campaigns. Sleep presented another set of problems that medieval military manuals had not adequately addressed. Sleeping in armor was theoretically possible. Many knights had practiced it during their training, but doing so night after night for months at a time proved far more difficult than occasional practice sessions had suggested. The weight of the armor created pressure points that became increasingly painful over time, and the metal rings conducted cold from the ground directly to the wearer's body, making it nearly impossible to stay warm during cold nights. Most knights eventually developed personal systems for managing sleep while maintaining some degree of protection. Some removed only the heaviest pieces of armor while keeping lighter protective elements in place. Others arranged their sleeping positions to distribute the armor's weight more evenly, though this often required sleeping props and supports that were difficult to transport and set up. A few hardy souls attempted to sleep in full armor throughout their entire campaigns, but most of these knights developed chronic pain, sleep deprivation, and various stress-related conditions that reduced their combat effectiveness. The social aspects of wearing armor also created unexpected complications during extended campaigns. Male hauberks were designed to project an image of military competence and social status. But after months of wear under campaign conditions, most armor looked less impressive and more pathetic. Rust stains, dents from minor impacts, and general wear and tear gradually transformed gleaming symbols of knightly virtue into shabby reminders of the gap between military theory and military practice. The sounds produced by male armor were another consideration that romantic military literature had largely ignored. 40 pounds of interlocked iron rings created a constant symphony of metallic noise during any kind of movement. Walking, riding, fighting, or even simply breathing produced distinctive sounds that made stealth impossible and announced the wearer's location to anyone within hearing distance. This acoustic signature was particularly problematic during reconnaissance missions or surprise attacks, where the element of surprise was crucial for success. Medieval armies attempted to solve this problem through various techniques for muffling armor noise, usually involving additional padding or cloth wrappings. But these solutions added weight and bulk, while providing only marginal sound reduction. The result was that armored knights were essentially walking advertisements for their own presence, which limited their tactical options and made certain types of military operations impossible. The psychological effects of prolonged armor wear were subtle but significant. Knights who spent months encased in metal protection often developed what modern military psychologists might recognize as a form of sensory deprivation. The armor blocked normal tactile sensations, restricted vision and hearing, and created a physical barrier between the wearer and the external world. Some knights reported feeling disconnected from their environment, struggling to judge distances accurately, or having difficulty maintaining situational awareness during combat. The social dynamics of armor ownership and maintenance within crusading armies reveal fascinating insights into medieval military culture and the complex relationships between practical necessity social status, and military effectiveness. Armor wasn't just protective equipment. It was a visible symbol of wealth, status, and military competence that could determine a knight's position within the army's social hierarchy. The quality differences between various suits of armor were immediately apparent to anyone with military experience. The finest male hauberks, crafted by master armorers in major European cities, featured rings that were perfectly shaped, uniformly sized, and seamlessly integrated into protective patterns that balanced coverage with mobility. These premium suits cost enormous sums, but provided superior protection and wore better under campaign conditions than cheaper alternatives. Most knights, however, couldn't afford the finest available armor and made do with suits that ranged from adequate to genuinely dangerous. Cheaper male hauberks featured rings that were poorly shaped, inconsistently sized, or improperly joined, creating weak points where enemy weapons could penetrate or where the armor itself might fail under stress. Some budget armor was so poorly constructed that it provided little more protection than thick cloth, while adding all the weight and mobility restrictions of proper mail. The used armor market was a thriving sector of medieval military commerce, though purchasing second-hand protection carried obvious risks. Armor that had been worn by knights killed in previous battles might bear damage that wasn't immediately apparent, but could prove fatal when tested in actual combat. Some unscrupulous dealers attempted to repair damaged armor using inferior materials or techniques that looked acceptable, but failed when subjected to real stress. The process of acquiring properly fitted armor was complicated by the highly individual nature of medieval bodies and the limited availability of skilled armorers. Unlike modern manufactured goods, medieval armor had to be custom-made for each individual wearer, taking into account not just basic measurements, but also personal fighting style, preferred weapons, and the specific types of combat the knight expected to encounter. Getting this process wrong could result in armor that was uncomfortable, ineffective, or actively dangerous. The maintenance requirements of different armor types created additional social stratification within crusading armies. Knights with high-quality armor and skilled servants could maintain their equipment in good condition throughout extended campaigns, preserving both their protective effectiveness and their social status. Knights with inferior armor or inadequate support staff found their equipment deteriorating rapidly under campaign conditions, making them increasingly vulnerable in combat and reducing their status within the army. The climate adaptation challenges of European armor in Middle Eastern conditions led to various improvisation attempts that were often more creative than successful. Some knights attempted to modify their male hauberks by removing rings in strategic locations to improve ventilation, though this obviously reduced protective coverage. Others tried adding additional padding or ventilation systems, usually with results that were awkward and largely ineffective. Local armorers in the Eastern Mediterranean had developed their own approaches to protective equipment that were better suited to regional climate conditions. But these styles were often viewed with suspicion by Western knights, who associated unfamiliar armor designs with inferior quality or questionable military effectiveness. The result was that most crusaders continued wearing European-style armor that was poorly adapted to local conditions rather than adopting protective systems that might have been more practical, but would have compromised their social status. the psychological aspects of armor dependency became apparent as campaigns progressed and knights were forced to choose between protection and practicality. Some warriors became so attached to their armor that they refused to remove it even when doing so would have improved their effectiveness in specific situations. Others developed a kind of armor anxiety, becoming convinced that any reduction in protective coverage would result in immediate death or injury. The economics of armor replacement during extended campaigns created additional pressures within crusading armies. Knights whose armor was damaged or lost faced the choice between purchasing expensive replacements from local craftsmen, attempting to acquire second-hand equipment from casualties, or continuing to fight with inadequate protection. Each option carried significant risks and costs that could affect not only individual knights, but entire military units. The cultural differences in armor preferences among various national contingents within crusading armies led to ongoing debates about the relative merits of different protective systems. Norman knights favored different armor styles than German nobles, who in turn had different preferences than English barons or Italian mercenaries. These differences weren't merely aesthetic. They reflected different approaches to warfare, different manufacturing traditions, and different ideas about the proper balance between protection and mobility. The social rituals surrounding armor care and maintenance became important elements of military camp life, providing opportunities for knights to demonstrate their military competence, their attention to detail, and their respect for the tools of their profession. The daily routine of cleaning, inspecting, and repairing armor became a form of military meditation that helped maintain morale and unit cohesion during the long periods of boredom that characterized most military campaigns. The innovation pressures of actual combat led to various field modifications and improvements that were often more practical than the original designs. Knights who survived multiple battles learned to identify and address the specific weaknesses in their protective systems, developing personal modifications that improved effectiveness, even if they compromised the armor's appearance or traditional design principles. And as we leave this exploration of how medieval armor actually worked in practice rather than theory, let's turn our attention to the even more fundamental challenge of simply staying alive long enough to reach the battlefield, where crusading knights would discover that disease, starvation, and basic hygiene were far more dangerous enemies than any Saracen warrior they might eventually face in glorious combat. Chapter 4. The unglamorous art of not dying before you reach Jerusalem. Picture yourself as a knight who has survived the financial ruin of crusade preparation, the logistical nightmare of medieval travel, and the daily torment of wearing 40 pounds of mail armor in increasingly hostile climates. You're feeling rather proud of your resilience and looking forward to proving your martial prowess against the enemies of Christendom. Then you wake up one morning with what medieval physicians would diagnose as an imbalance of the humours, and what modern doctors would recognize as dysentery, and you realize that your greatest enemy isn't going to be sword-wielding Saracens, but rather the medieval understanding of human biology. The medical care available to crusading armies was a fascinating mixture of folk wisdom, classical theory, religious belief, and complete guesswork that somehow managed to kill more patients than it cured, while maintaining the confidence of practitioners who genuinely believed they were applying the finest medical knowledge available to medieval science. The physicians who accompanied crusading armies were typically monks who had studied classical medical texts, university-trained scholars who had memorized the works of ancient authorities, or simply experienced military surgeons who had learned their craft through trial and error on previous campaigns. The theoretical foundation of medieval medicine was the classical theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which supposedly needed to be maintained in perfect balance for optimal health. According to this system, illness resulted from humoral imbalances that could be corrected through appropriate treatments, usually involving bloodletting, purging, or dietary modifications designed to restore the proper proportions of bodily fluids. This approach to medical treatment was logical within its own theoretical framework, but it had the unfortunate characteristic of being almost completely wrong about everything important. Medieval physicians had virtually no understanding of infectious disease, bacterial contamination, basic hygiene, or human anatomy, which meant that their well-intentioned treatments often made patients sicker rather than better, while creating conditions that encouraged the spread of disease throughout military camps. The standard treatment for most illnesses was bloodletting, which involved either opening veins with sharp instruments or applying leeches to draw out the supposedly corrupted blood that was causing the patient's problems. This treatment was based on the theory that excess blood was the root cause of most medical problems, and that removing some of this blood would restore the proper humoral balance and return the patient to health. The practice of bloodletting in medieval military camps was particularly dangerous because the instruments used were rarely properly cleaned. The practitioners often had limited training in anatomy, and the unsanitary conditions of campaign life made infection almost inevitable. Knights who survived enemy weapons often died from infections contracted during medical treatment, though medieval medical theory attributed these deaths to the progression of the original illness, rather than complications from the treatment itself. Purging was another standard medieval medical treatment that involved giving patients various substances designed to induce vomiting, diarrhea, or both simultaneously. The theory was that illness was caused by corrupted substances within the body that needed to be expelled, and that vigorous purging would remove these harmful materials and restore health. In practice, purging treatments often left patients severely dehydrated and weakened at exactly the moment when they needed all their strength to fight off whatever illness had originally afflicted them. The medications available to medieval military physicians were primarily herbal preparations that had been used for generations with varying degrees of effectiveness. Some of these traditional remedies actually had beneficial properties. Willow bark contained compounds similar to modern aspirin, for example, but many were either useless or actively harmful. The problem was that medieval medical practitioners had no reliable way to distinguish between helpful and harmful treatments, so they tended to apply all available remedies simultaneously on the theory that something would work. The diagnostic techniques used by medieval physicians were creative, but largely unreliable. They examined patients' urine, blood, and other bodily fluids for signs of humoral imbalance, often consulting elaborate charts that supposedly correlated fluid colors and consistencies with specific medical conditions. They also relied heavily on astrology. believing that the positions of various planets and stars influenced both the onset of illness and the likelihood of successful treatment. The surgical procedures available to medieval military medicine were limited but occasionally effective, particularly for treating obvious injuries like sword cuts, arrow wounds, or broken bones. Military surgeons had extensive experience with trauma injuries and had developed reasonably effective techniques for stopping bleeding, cleaning wounds, and setting fractures. However, they had no understanding of infection control, anesthesia, or sterile technique, which meant that even successful surgical procedures often led to complications that proved fatal. The psychological aspects of medieval medical treatment were perhaps as important as the physical interventions. Patients who believed in the efficacy of their physicians' treatments often showed improvement regardless of whether the treatments themselves had any objective medical value. The ritual aspects of medieval medicine, the elaborate preparations, the impressive terminology, the confident demeanor of the practitioners provided psychological comfort that may have had genuine therapeutic benefits, even when the actual treatments were useless or harmful. The availability of medical care varied dramatically depending on a knight's social status and financial resources. Wealthy nobles could afford to bring their own personal physicians on crusade, ensuring access to the finest medical care available in medieval Europe. Lesser knights had to depend on whatever medical practitioners happened to be available in the army's general medical corps, which might include anyone from university-trained physicians to barely literate folk healers who claimed medical expertise. The concentration of thousands of people and animals in temporary military camps created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Though medieval medical theory had no understanding of contagion, bacterial transmission, or basic epidemiology, what medieval commanders viewed as normal military logistics, gathering large numbers of warriors in confined spaces, moving them across unfamiliar territories, and maintaining them under field conditions for extended periods, was actually a perfect recipe for creating and spreading epidemic diseases. The sanitary conditions in crusading army camps were appalling even by medieval standards, which weren't particularly high to begin with. Thousands of people and their animals concentrated in temporary settlements produced enormous quantities of human and animal waste that had to be disposed of somehow. Medieval military manuals provided virtually no guidance on waste management, latrine construction, or basic camp hygiene, leaving these crucial decisions to commanders who had no understanding of the relationship between sanitation and disease. The typical crusading army camp was essentially a medieval biological disaster waiting to happen. Human waste, animal droppings, food scraps, and various other organic materials accumulated in and around living areas, creating breeding grounds for flies, rats, and other disease vectors. The water sources used for drinking, cooking, and washing quickly became contaminated with runoff from these waste accumulations, though medieval commanders had no way to recognize or prevent this contamination. Dysentery was perhaps the most common and devastating disease affecting crusading armies, though medieval physicians didn't understand its causes and had no effective treatments for it. The disease spread rapidly through contaminated water supplies and poor sanitation, causing severe diarrhea, dehydration, and often death. Modern medical historians estimate that dysentery killed more crusaders than all enemy action combined, though medieval chroniclers usually attributed these deaths to fever or exhaustion, rather than recognizing them as symptoms of a specific disease. The treatment of dysentery, according to medieval medical theory, typically involved bloodletting and purging, which were precisely the wrong approaches for a condition that was already causing severe fluid loss and dehydration. Patients who might have recovered with proper hydration and basic supportive care often died from the effects of medical treatments that further weakened their already compromised systems. Typhus was another major killer in crusading armies, spread by body lice that thrived in the unwashed conditions of medieval military camps. The disease caused high fevers, severe headaches, and often death, but medieval physicians had no understanding of its transmission mechanism and usually attributed outbreaks to bad air or astrological influences. The standard treatments, bloodletting, purging, and various herbal preparations were entirely ineffective against typhus and often hastened patients' deaths. Malaria affected crusading armies operating in Mediterranean coastal regions, where mosquito-borne diseases were endemic. Medieval physicians recognized malaria as a distinct condition. They called it quartan fever because of its characteristic 4-day cycle of symptoms. But they had no understanding of its cause or effective treatments for it. The disease caused recurring episodes of fever, chills, and weakness that could incapacitate entire military units for weeks at a time. The psychological impact of epidemic diseases was almost as devastating as their physical effects. Knights who had expected to die gloriously in battle against the enemies of Christ instead found themselves watching helplessly as their companions died slowly and miserably from diseases that medieval medicine couldn't explain or treat effectively. The random nature of epidemic illness, the way it struck down the strong and spared the weak, killed the pious and preserved the sinful, challenged fundamental medieval beliefs about divine justice and the special protection accorded to holy warriors. The economic effects of epidemic diseases on crusading armies were enormous, but rarely calculated by medieval commanders. Sick knights couldn't fight effectively, required care from healthy followers, and consumed medical resources without contributing to military objectives. The death of experienced warriors represented a loss of military investment that could rarely be replaced during active campaigns. The time spent caring for sick and dying soldiers delayed military operations and provided enemies with opportunities to prepare defenses or launch counterattacks. The spread of disease between different contingents within crusading armies created diplomatic as well as medical problems. When German knights began dying from diseases that seemed to affect them more severely than French or Norman contingents, suspicions of poison or witchcraft were inevitable. These suspicions led to accusations, conflicts, and sometimes violence between allied forces that should have been cooperating against common enemies. Medieval armies had no effective methods for quarantining sick soldiers or preventing the spread of contagious diseases. The concept of contagion wasn't part of medieval medical theory, so the standard practice was to house sick knights alongside healthy ones in the hope that proximity to vigorous companions would help restore their strength. This approach virtually guaranteed that diseases would spread throughout entire units before anyone recognized the scope of the problem. The inadequate food preservation and storage techniques used by medieval armies created additional opportunities for disease transmission. Spoiled meat, contaminated grain, and improperly stored provisions were common sources of food poisoning and other illnesses that weakened soldiers' resistance to epidemic diseases. Medieval food safety standards were minimal even under ideal conditions, and campaign conditions made proper food handling nearly impossible. The nutritional challenges facing crusading armies reveal perhaps the most fundamental disconnect between medieval military theory and practical reality. While romantic chronicles focused on the martial prowess and spiritual dedication of holy warriors, the prosaic truth was that most crusading knights spent far more time worrying about their next meal than planning their next glorious charge against the infidels. Medieval understanding of nutrition was primitive, even by the standards of the time, based primarily on classical theories about the properties of different foods, rather than any systematic knowledge of human dietary requirements. Medieval physicians classified foods according to their supposed humoral properties, whether they were hot or cold, wet or dry, and recommended diets based on the patient's presumed humoral balance rather than their actual nutritional needs. The standard medieval military diet, when it was available at all, consisted primarily of bread, salted meat, cheese, and whatever vegetables could be preserved for extended periods without spoiling. This diet was monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and often contaminated with various preservatives and additives that caused their own health problems. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rarely available during extended campaigns, leading to nutritional deficiency diseases that medieval physicians couldn't identify or treat effectively. Scurvy was a particular problem for crusading armies operating far from sources of fresh food, though medieval medical theory had no understanding of vitamin deficiency diseases. Knights who had been subsisting on preserved foods for months would develop weakness, bleeding gums, loose teeth, and various other symptoms that medieval physicians attributed to humoral imbalances rather than nutritional deficiencies. The standard treatments, bloodletting and purging, were not only ineffective, but actually made the condition worse by further weakening already malnourished patients. The procurement and distribution of food supplies for large military expeditions presented logistical challenges that tested the organizational abilities of medieval commanders who had no formal training in supply chain management. A typical crusading army required several tons of food daily just to maintain basic subsistence levels, and this food had to be transported across hostile territory, stored under primitive conditions, and distributed to thousands of people who had different dietary preferences and requirements. The preservation techniques available to medieval armies were limited and often unreliable. Salting, smoking, and drying could extend the storage life of meat and fish, but these processes required facilities and expertise that weren't readily available under campaign conditions. Grain could be stored in sacks or barrels, but it was vulnerable to moisture, rodents, and various forms of contamination that could make it inedible or dangerous to consume. The foraging strategies employed by crusading armies were often more destructive than productive, alienating local populations and reducing the very food sources that armies hoped to exploit. Medieval soldiers sent out to requisition supplies from local farms often lacked the knowledge to distinguish between seed grains that should be preserved for planting and food grains that could be safely consumed. They frequently destroyed crops, livestock, and food storage facilities, creating famine conditions that affected both military forces and civilian populations. The seasonal availability of different foods created additional complications for military planning. Armies that arrived in agricultural regions during harvest time might find abundant supplies available for purchase or requisition, while the same regions might offer virtually nothing during winter months or drought years. Medieval commanders had limited ability to predict or prepare for these seasonal variations, leading to frequent supply crises that could paralyze entire expeditions. The cultural and religious dietary restrictions observed by different contingents within crusading armies created unexpected complications for food distribution and preparation. Various Christian sects had different ideas about appropriate foods for religious warriors, while the presence of converted Muslims or local Christian allies added additional dietary requirements that military cooks had to accommodate somehow. The psychological effects of chronic malnutrition on military morale and effectiveness were severe but poorly understood by medieval commanders. Hungry soldiers were more prone to illness, less able to perform physical tasks, more likely to desert or mutiny, and generally less effective in combat situations. The gradual deterioration of army effectiveness due to nutritional problems was often attributed to cowardice, lack of faith, or poor leadership, rather than the more mundane reality of inadequate food supplies. The relationship between nutrition and disease resistance was completely unknown to medieval medical practitioners, though the correlation was obvious to anyone who observed military camps over extended periods. Well-fed soldiers remained healthy longer and recovered more quickly from illnesses, while malnourished troops succumbed rapidly to diseases that might have been survivable under better nutritional conditions. The economic aspects of military nutrition were staggering and rarely fully calculated by crusading armies until it was too late to address them effectively. The cost of transporting food supplies across thousands of miles of hostile territory often exceeded the original purchase price by factors of 10 or more. The waste rates for preserved foods under campaign conditions were enormous, with significant percentages of supplies becoming inedible due to spoilage, contamination, or simple mishandling. And as we leave this exploration of how medieval knights struggled against the fundamental challenges of staying alive long enough to fight their holy war, let's turn our attention to what happened when these malnourished, disease-ridden, and generally miserable warriors finally encountered the sophisticated military forces they had traveled so far to fight, where they would discover that their enemies had been preparing for their arrival and had developed some very effective strategies for dealing with Western military tourists. Chapter 5. The Enemy Knows You're Coming. Medieval Intelligence Wars. Picture this rather embarrassing scenario. You've spent 2 years traveling from France to Syria, overcoming countless obstacles, surviving diseases, and enduring hardships that would challenge modern special forces, all while maintaining the romantic notion that you're embarking on a surprise military expedition to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. You finally arrive at the walls of some strategically important Middle Eastern city, expecting to catch the defenders off guard with your unexpected appearance, only to discover that the local emir not only knew you were coming, but has been tracking your progress for months, knows exactly how many knights you have, what condition your army is in, and has prepared specifically tailored defenses designed to counter your particular military weaknesses. Congratulations. You've just encountered one of the most uncomfortable realities of crusading warfare. While European knights were stumbling blindly across unfamiliar territories with virtually no reliable information about their enemies, their objectives, or even their routes. The Islamic world had developed sophisticated intelligence networks that made Western military movements about as secret as modern reality television shows. The intelligence advantages enjoyed by Islamic forces during the Crusading period were so overwhelming that they bordered on the absurd, while Christian armies were essentially traveling blind, relying on outdated maps, unreliable guides, and whatever rumors they could gather from merchants and pilgrims. Their Muslim opponents had access to information networks that spanned continents and provided detailed, up-to-date intelligence about Western military preparations, movement patterns, and strategic intentions. The foundation of Islamic intelligence superiority was the extensive trade networks that connected the Middle East with Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. Muslim merchants traveled regularly along established routes that took them through every major European city, where they observed military preparations, overheard strategic discussions, and gathered information about crusading armies long before those armies began their eastward journey. These merchants returned to their home regions with detailed reports about Western military capabilities, leadership personalities, and strategic plans that gave Islamic commanders months or years to prepare appropriate countermeasures. The information gathering process was so thorough that Muslim commanders often knew more about crusading armies than the crusaders knew about themselves. Islamic intelligence networks tracked not only the overall size and composition of Western expeditions, but also details about individual leaders, their military experience, their financial resources, their personal rivalries, and their strategic preferences. This knowledge allowed Muslim commanders to predict Western behavior with remarkable accuracy and prepare tactics specifically designed to exploit known weaknesses. The contrast with European intelligence capabilities was stark and embarrassing. Most crusading armies had virtually no reliable information about the territories they planned to traverse, the enemies they expected to fight, or the political conditions they would encounter in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their knowledge of Islamic military capabilities was based primarily on romanticized stories, outdated pilgrims' accounts, and wishful thinking that portrayed Muslim armies as numerically superior, but technologically inferior forces that could be defeated through superior Western fighting spirit and divine intervention. European maps of the Eastern Mediterranean were so inaccurate as to be worse than useless, leading armies hundreds of miles off course and into territories controlled by entirely different political entities than the ones they expected to encounter. Western intelligence about Islamic military capabilities was similarly flawed, based on classical sources, crusading propaganda, and the optimistic assumptions of military leaders who had never actually fought against Muslim armies. The speed of information transmission within Islamic territories was another crucial advantage that European armies consistently underestimated. While Christian messages traveled at the speed of individual messengers crossing hostile territories on dangerous roads, Islamic information networks could relay intelligence across vast distances using established communication systems that included messenger relays, signal fires, and even primitive forms of cryptography that protected sensitive information from interception. The result was that Muslim commanders could coordinate defensive strategies across multiple regions, sharing intelligence about crusading army movements and adjusting their tactics based on real-time information about Western capabilities and intentions. Meanwhile, different contingents within the same crusading army often had no reliable way to communicate with each other over distances of more than a few miles, making coordinated strategy virtually impossible. The cultural advantages that supported Islamic intelligence gathering were equally significant. Muslim societies included large populations of merchants, scholars, and travelers who moved freely between different regions and cultures, giving them opportunities to observe and report on foreign military activities. Many of these intelligence sources were motivated by genuine religious conviction, viewing information gathering as a form of jihad that supported the defense of Islamic territories against foreign invasion. European societies, by contrast, had much more limited international contacts and fewer individuals with the linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and travel experience necessary for effective intelligence gathering in foreign territories. Most crusading knights had never traveled outside their home regions before embarking on their holy war, and few had any understanding of Islamic languages, customs, or political structures. The technological aspects of intelligence gathering also favored Islamic forces. Muslim societies had preserved and developed many of the information management techniques developed by Byzantine and Persian empires, including sophisticated record-keeping systems, courier networks, and administrative structures that could process and distribute intelligence efficiently. European feudal societies had much more primitive administrative capabilities and lacked the institutional structures necessary for systematic intelligence gathering and analysis. The psychological warfare implications of this intelligence imbalance were enormous. Islamic commanders could use their detailed knowledge of crusading armies to craft psychological operations designed to exploit Western fears, superstitions, and internal divisions. They could time their attacks to coincide with known supply shortages, target specific leaders whose removal would cause maximum disruption, and spread disinformation that would confuse and demoralize their enemies. The sophisticated deception operations conducted by Islamic forces against crusading armies reveal a level of strategic thinking that puts most medieval European military planning to shame. While Christian knights approached warfare with a straightforward, almost naively honest approach that emphasized direct confrontation and personal honor, their Muslim opponents had developed elaborate systems of misdirection, false intelligence, and strategic deception that turned crusading armies' own expectations and assumptions against them. The foundation of Islamic deception operations was their superior understanding of European military psychology and decision-making processes. Through years of observation and intelligence gathering, Muslim commanders had identified predictable patterns in Western military behavior that could be exploited through carefully crafted deception campaigns. They understood that crusading knights were motivated by concepts of personal honor, religious duty, and social status that made them vulnerable to specific types of psychological manipulation. One of the most effective deception techniques involved the deliberate spread of false intelligence about Islamic military capabilities and intentions. Muslim commanders would ensure that crusading armies received information suggesting that key cities were lightly defended, that local populations were sympathetic to Christian rule, or that enemy forces were divided by internal conflicts. This false intelligence encouraged Western armies to make strategic decisions based on inaccurate assessments of the situation, often leading them into carefully prepared traps. The sophistication of these deception operations was remarkable by medieval standards. Islamic commanders didn't simply spread random false information, but instead crafted elaborate narratives that were consistent, believable, and designed to reinforce existing European preconceptions about the Middle East. They understood that the most effective lies are those that tell people what they already want to believe, and they tailored their disinformation accordingly. The use of double agents and turned informants was another area where Islamic intelligence operations demonstrated superior professionalism compared to their European counterparts. Muslim commanders systematically identified and recruited Europeans who could provide intelligence about crusading army plans and capabilities. These agents included merchants who traveled with crusading armies, local Christians who served as guides or interpreters, and even disaffected crusaders who had become disillusioned with their holy mission. The recruitment process for these agents was often subtle and gradual, beginning with small requests for information that seemed harmless and gradually escalating to more significant intelligence gathering activities. Many agents probably never realized the full extent of their cooperation with enemy intelligence services, believing they were simply providing friendly assistance to local populations or engaging in normal commercial activities. The management of these intelligence assets required sophisticated operational security measures that medieval European armies couldn't match. Islamic commanders used compartmentalized information systems that prevented individual agents from understanding the full scope of intelligence operations, employed coded communication systems that protected sensitive information from interception, and maintained elaborate cover stories that concealed their agents' true activities from hostile counterintelligence efforts. The economic aspects of intelligence warfare also favored Islamic forces, who had access to established financial networks that could fund intelligence operations across multiple regions and time periods. The same merchant networks that facilitated trade also provided convenient mechanisms for transferring money to intelligence assets, purchasing information from willing sources, and funding the infrastructure necessary for systematic intelligence gathering. European armies, by contrast, had limited financial resources for intelligence activities and lacked the institutional knowledge necessary for effective intelligence operations. Most crusading commanders viewed intelligence gathering as a relatively unimportant military activity that didn't deserve significant resource allocation, a perspective that consistently put them at severe disadvantages when facing enemies who understood the strategic value of superior information. The psychological warfare implications of these intelligence operations extended far beyond simple military deception. Islamic commanders used their intelligence capabilities to identify and exploit internal divisions within crusading armies, spreading information designed to increase tensions between different national contingents, exacerbate personal rivalries between rival commanders, and undermine confidence in military leadership. These psychological operations were particularly effective because they exploited real weaknesses within crusading armies. The tensions between Norman, French, German, and English contingents were genuine and well documented, making it relatively easy for skilled psychological warfare specialists to increase these tensions through carefully targeted disinformation campaigns. The timing of psychological warfare operations was often as important as their content. Islamic commanders would wait for moments when crusading armies were already under stress, during supply shortages, after military defeats, or when disease outbreaks were affecting morale, before launching psychological operations designed to maximize their disruptive effects. The technical aspects of medieval psychological warfare included the use of captured documents, forged letters, and planted evidence designed to support false narratives about enemy intentions or capabilities. Islamic forces became skilled at creating convincing forgeries of European documents, complete with appropriate seals, signatures, and linguistic patterns that would pass casual inspection by their intended targets. The counterintelligence challenges facing European armies were essentially insurmountable, given their limited understanding of intelligence operations and their lack of systematic security procedures. Most crusading armies made no serious attempt to protect sensitive information, control access to military planning sessions, or verify the reliability of local sources who provided intelligence about enemy activities. The result was that Islamic forces often had better information about crusading army plans than many European commanders had about their own strategic situations. The security breaches were so systematic and pervasive that Islamic intelligence services could accurately predict Western military movements weeks or months in advance, giving them enormous advantages in strategic planning and resource allocation. The cumulative impact of European intelligence failures during the crusading period reveals a level of strategic incompetence that would be almost comical, if it weren't so tragic for the thousands of knights who died as a result of their commanders' inability to understand their enemies, their environment, or even their own strategic situation. The intelligence failures weren't occasional mistakes or temporary oversights, but rather systematic problems that reflected fundamental flaws in European approaches to warfare and military planning. The most basic intelligence failure involved the persistent European misunderstanding of Islamic military capabilities and technological sophistication. Despite decades of military contact with Muslim armies, many crusading commanders continued to believe that their enemies were essentially barbarian forces that could be defeated through superior Western fighting spirit and better individual warrior skills. This fundamental misassessment led to tactical and strategic decisions that consistently played to Islamic advantages while negating European strengths. The technological intelligence failures were particularly embarrassing because they involved areas where European armies believed they held decisive advantages. Many crusading commanders assumed that their heavy cavalry would dominate Middle Eastern battlefields, not realizing that their Muslim opponents had developed sophisticated anti-cavalry tactics, weapons, and defensive systems specifically designed to counter Western military strengths. The siege warfare intelligence was similarly flawed, with European armies consistently underestimating the defensive capabilities of Middle Eastern fortifications and the engineering expertise available to Islamic defenders. Crusading armies would invest months in siege operations based on faulty intelligence about enemy defensive capabilities, only to discover that their siege equipment was inadequate, their tactics were inappropriate, and their enemies were far better prepared than expected. The political intelligence failures were perhaps even more costly than the military ones. European commanders consistently misunderstood the complex political relationship between different Islamic rulers, often making strategic decisions based on outdated or completely inaccurate information about local alliances, rivalries, and power structures. These political miscalculations led to diplomatic disasters that turned potential allies into enemies and made military operations far more difficult than necessary. The economic intelligence was similarly flawed, with European armies consistently underestimating the costs of extended operations in the Middle East and overestimating the wealth available through conquest. Many crusading expeditions were planned based on optimistic assumptions about plunder opportunities that had little basis in reality, leading to financial crises that crippled military effectiveness and forced premature endings to otherwise successful campaigns. The geographic intelligence failures were so systematic that they suggest European commanders were actively avoiding accurate information about the territories they planned to traverse. Maps were inaccurate, distances were miscalculated, terrain challenges were underestimated, and climate conditions were completely misunderstood. These geographic intelligence failures led directly to logistical disasters that killed more crusaders than enemy action. The linguistic intelligence barriers were another fundamental problem that European armies never adequately addressed. Most crusading commanders had no reliable way to communicate with local populations, verify information from local sources, or understand intelligence gathered from captured enemy documents. This linguistic isolation made effective intelligence gathering virtually impossible and left European armies dependent on interpreters whose reliability and loyalty were often questionable. The cultural intelligence failures were equally problematic, with European commanders consistently misunderstanding Islamic military customs, religious practices, and social structures. These cultural misunderstandings led to strategic mistakes, diplomatic failures, and tactical decisions that played directly into enemy hands. The operational security failures within crusading armies were so pervasive that they essentially guaranteed that sensitive information would reach enemy intelligence services. Military plans were discussed openly in camp. Strategic documents were inadequately protected, and local interpreters and guides had unrestricted access to confidential information. These security failures meant that Islamic forces often knew more about European military plans than many European commanders knew about their own operations. The counterintelligence capabilities of crusading armies were essentially non-existent, with no systematic efforts to identify enemy agents, protect sensitive information, or verify the reliability of intelligence sources. This meant that European armies were completely vulnerable to enemy deception operations and had no effective way to distinguish between accurate intelligence and enemy disinformation. The long-term consequences of these intelligence failures extended far beyond individual military campaigns. The systematic European inability to understand their enemies, their environment, and their own limitations contributed to strategic decisions that prolonged conflicts, increased casualties, and ultimately undermined the entire crusading enterprise. The irony of these intelligence failures was that accurate information was often available to European commanders who simply chose to ignore it in favor of intelligence that supported their preconceived notions about the enemy and the strategic situation. The problem wasn't necessarily a lack of available intelligence, but rather the inability to evaluate and use intelligence effectively. The institutional legacy of these intelligence failures influenced European military thinking for generations, creating persistent blind spots and strategic misconceptions that continue to affect European military operations in the Middle East, long after the crusading period ended. The failure to learn from these intelligence mistakes suggests fundamental problems with European military institutions and strategic thinking that went far beyond the specific challenges of crusading warfare. And as we leave this exploration of how European intelligence failures systematically undermined crusading military operations, let's turn our attention to the actual combat experience of knights who finally reached the battlefield, where they would discover that their enemies had been using all that superior intelligence to prepare some very unpleasant surprises for Western warriors who still believed that individual martial prowess and divine favor would overcome superior strategy and tactical preparation. Chapter 6. The reality of medieval combat when romance meets sharp objects. Picture this delightfully sobering moment. After 2 years of preparation, travel, disease, and various medieval miseries, you finally find yourself facing an actual enemy army across some Middle Eastern battlefield. The morning sun glints magnificently off your mail hauberk. Your destrier prances eagerly beneath you, and for a brief, shining moment, you feel like the embodiment of Christian knighthood that you always imagined yourself to be. Then the arrows start flying. Your horse steps in a hole and goes down hard, and you discover that actual medieval combat bears about as much resemblance to romantic literature as modern professional wrestling bears to actual athletic competition. The fundamental reality of medieval battlefield combat was that it was loud, confusing, terrifying, and over much more quickly than anyone expected, leaving participants with vivid memories of small, personal encounters and virtually no understanding of what had happened in the broader tactical situation. The romantic notion of knights surveying battlefields like chess masters, making strategic decisions based on clear understanding of enemy movements and friendly capabilities, was complete fantasy that bore no relationship to the actual experience of medieval warfare. Medieval battles were essentially controlled chaos events, where individual warriors could see and influence only tiny portions of the overall engagement. A knight in the middle of a cavalry charge could observe perhaps 50 yards in any direction, had no reliable communication with other units, and had to make life or death decisions based on fragmentary information while dealing with immediate threats to his personal survival. The noise level of medieval battlefields was overwhelming and disorienting for participants who had trained primarily in small group combat situations. The combination of thousands of men shouting, horses neighing in pain and fear, metal weapons clashing against armor and shields, and the screams of wounded warriors created an acoustic environment that made verbal communication virtually impossible beyond distances of a few feet. The visual confusion was equally challenging, with dust clouds, weapon smoke from primitive firearms, and the general chaos of large-scale combat, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from enemy at distances greater than immediate sword range. The heraldic devices that were supposed to help identify different units and commanders were often obscured by dust, damage, or the press of combat, leaving individual warriors to make split-second decisions about whether nearby figures were allies or enemies. The physical demands of medieval combat in full armor were staggering and rarely appreciated by modern people, whose understanding of medieval warfare comes primarily from Hollywood films. Fighting in 40 pounds of mail armor while wielding heavy weapons was exhausting under ideal conditions, and battlefield conditions were far from ideal. Most knights could maintain peak combat effectiveness for only a few minutes before fatigue began to seriously compromise their fighting ability. The weapons used in medieval combat were designed for maximum lethality rather than sporting fairness, and their effects on human bodies were devastating in ways that medieval chroniclers preferred not to describe in detail. Swords, maces, war hammers, and axes were optimized for penetrating armor and crushing bones, creating injuries that were often fatal even when they weren't immediately incapacitating. The medical care available on medieval battlefields was primitive and often counterproductive, consisting primarily of field surgery, performed by individuals with limited training using unsterilized instruments under unsanitary conditions. Many warriors who survived their initial injuries died later from infections, blood loss, or complications from well-intentioned but medically inappropriate treatments. The psychological aspects of medieval combat were perhaps as challenging as the physical demands. Warriors who had trained for individual combat situations found themselves in large-scale engagements where personal skill mattered less than unit cohesion, tactical positioning, and simple luck. The randomness of battlefield survival, the way that skilled veterans could be killed by stray arrows, while inexperienced novices emerged unscathed, challenged fundamental medieval beliefs about divine justice and the relationship between virtue and success. The armor that knights had invested so heavily in often proved less effective than expected under battlefield conditions. Mail hauberks provided good protection against slashing attacks, but were vulnerable to thrusting weapons, blunt trauma, and the kind of crushing impacts that occurred when heavily armored warriors fell from their horses during combat. Many knights discovered that their expensive protective equipment gave them confidence but not invulnerability. The horses that were central to medieval military theory were actually extremely vulnerable in combat situations, creating tactical problems that European military doctrine had never adequately addressed. War horses were large, expensive, and difficult to replace, but they were also prime targets for enemy infantry, who understood that dismounting a knight was often more effective than trying to penetrate his armor directly. The battlefield recovery of wounded warriors was haphazard and often impossible under combat conditions. Knights who fell during battle might lie helpless for hours while fighting continued around them, vulnerable to further injury from friend and enemy alike. The heavy armor that was supposed to protect them became a liability when they needed to move quickly or required medical attention. The tactical challenges facing crusading knights when they encountered Islamic armies reveal the fundamental inadequacy of European military doctrine for Middle Eastern warfare conditions. While Christian military theory emphasized individual martial prowess, heavy cavalry charges, and direct confrontation, their Muslim opponents had developed sophisticated tactical systems that were specifically designed to neutralize Western military advantages while exploiting European tactical limitations. The Islamic military response to European heavy cavalry was a masterpiece of tactical adaptation that turned the supposed strengths of crusading armies into exploitable weaknesses. Rather than meeting Western cavalry charges head-on in the kind of direct confrontation that European military doctrine assumed, Muslim commanders developed elaborate tactical systems based on mobility, missile weapons, and strategic retreat that frustrated European tactical expectations and gradually wore down crusading armies through attrition. The feigned retreat was perhaps the most effective tactical innovation employed against crusading armies, and it worked precisely because it exploited European assumptions about battlefield behavior and military honor. Crusading knights had been trained to pursue retreating enemies aggressively, viewing flight from battle as evidence of cowardice and divine disfavor. Islamic commanders understood this psychological vulnerability and used it to draw European cavalry into carefully prepared tactical traps. The execution of a successful feigned retreat required discipline, coordination, and tactical sophistication that was far beyond the capabilities of most European armies. Islamic forces had to maintain unit cohesion while appearing to flee in panic, coordinate their movements across multiple units without revealing their tactical intentions, and time their counterattacks precisely to catch pursuing enemies at maximum vulnerability. The missile weapon superiority enjoyed by Islamic armies was another tactical advantage that European military doctrine had failed to anticipate or counter effectively. Muslim armies typically included large numbers of highly skilled archers who could deliver sustained, accurate fire at ranges that exceeded the reach of European weapons. These archers were often mounted, giving them tactical mobility that allowed them to engage and disengage at will while avoiding direct combat with heavy cavalry.